Claudine Hemingway is a descendant of famed writer Ernest Hemingway. We bumped into each other at a party and decided to team up and dive deep into French history, but with a twist, by bringing a spotlight to those lesser-known creatives in France. This is History with a Hemingway.
So welcome back to Paris History, Avec, Hemingway. We are back with part 2 of the River Seine flooding. Let's see where Claudine takes us today.
Yeah, so last week we left off talking about the Seine and where it started to, this is where it just starts to get bad. So we left off on January 22nd where it was starting to come up. And now we're going to start to really get into the deeper level of it. No pun intended. But at this point along the Seine in central Paris, the walls of the quays were doing their best under the pressure of the water from both sides. As I mentioned last week, the walls, the soil was just saturated. And so you had issues with it. Basically, you might have this huge wall, protecting the Seine, but on the other side of the wall where we couldn't see, there was issues. And there is issues like this all the time. You see these pictures of, someplace in Florida that the house disappeared because a giant sinkhole the size of a house opened up and a house fell into it, or it just a sinkhole opens up on a road and, the wall, it just disappears. So these are all these things like, that natural disasters happen all the time, but everybody thinking that they could just go about their life and their roads and everything are going to be fine. This is why it's important to fix these things. Yeah, this isn't again. We could go in a whole other thing about infrastructure and global warming, but we won't do that today because this is more exciting to talk about the actual flood. But everything was because in the speed of the Seine, I mentioned that it was 15 miles an hour. It was going down the middle of the city, which is extremely fast. I don't know what it is now, but it's definitely not 15 miles per hour. And so the last memory of the flood was in 1896. And so this was basically this highest level that we are on January 22nd in 1896 was the highest that it had ever gone to the people in their recent memory. And this was now getting even higher. On January 23, Parisians started to actually just flee their homes. They tried to get out of there because people that were living on the ground level or living in a basement, their basements were completely flooded. Especially, this wasn't all the way out. So on one side, it kind of got all the way up to Gare Saint-Lazare on the right bank. The right bank actually fared a little bit better than the left bank or the islands. On the left bank, it went all the way over to Boulevard Saint-Germain. So I definitely would have had water. I live higher up in the building, but there would have been water right outside my door because it went all the way to past Boulevard Saint-Germain. Wow. And so these people that were living on these lower levels, they had to just completely take what they could and get out of there. They were trying, cars weren't able to get through as the water was rising. They were making makeshift walkways. If you see the pictures of basically they call it the Grand Exodus, when the occupation of Paris started, these roads outside of Paris were just filled with these, old 1940s cars that just had everything and, as many people as they could put on them to get out of there. And that's what they were doing in this flood of 1910, because they were thinking we're just, this is, a whole nother circumstance, but they could just drown in the water. Cool. And so at the time, the head of police was a gentleman named Louis Lapine. He tasked all the departments that had boats to help save all the people. As I said, they were building these makeshift walkways. There's some really cool pictures that I found online. I'll put on my website. There's one that they have basically the chairs that they had at the gardens at the time, not the fantastic chairs that we know today of the Luxembourg chairs, but these other wire and metal chairs that they had them lined up and people just were walking on the seats of the chairs to get over the water. And back then, this is 1910. So think about what the women were wearing then. They were always all wearing these great big hoops and these great big dresses with all these layers like that. Yeah. That would be horrible.
Oh man, it'd be so
right.
difficult.
You couldn't really, people were hiking up their skirts and showing their ankles, God forbid. But on January 23rd, the Seine was now up to the thighs of Zouave, which is 12 feet above the normal level. As I said, the left bank was hit pretty hard. And it was also because on the left bank, there was another river, and that river is still there today, but nobody sees it. It's actually called the Bivar River, and it once cut through the eastern side of the Latin Quarter. We talked about this when we talked about the Jardin des Plantes a few weeks ago. And that's why they built the Jardin des Plantes there, because it was right next to this river. So they thought it would give them, water. It once was lined with tanneries and other different crafts and butcher shops and everything. And they were disposing of the waste and the chemicals into the river. And it was just making it turn, for a few decades, just making just this putrid, horrific smell. And people were getting sick because of all the stuff they were throwing in this river. So for decades, this was happening. And so they thought, we need to just cover this river so it would just stop making people sick. But in 1910, they had already decided to do this in about 1908, but it wasn't finished in 1910, which either way, it wouldn't have mattered because, as I said, the water came from below. And so this river that partially was covered and partially above ground, of course, then flooded. So then you had that whole side there on the left bank. It was now getting shot from the Seine and from this river. So it was just never, there was just things about it that were just like you were just screwed with some places that you lived. The Boulevard Saint-Germain itself was buckling. The stones were breaking away. Walls were buckling. They were saying some places was like walking on jelly because the stones at this point, the cobblestones were just set in there. And this cobblestones over time have been used for everything from making barricades to weapons. In 1968, people would throw them. And then that's when they decided we need to set these cobblestones into cement or something to hold them. But here during the flood, they all started just picking up. And so they said sometimes some places were like walking on jelly. The metro lines were going, they couldn't go any farther. So there's the metro line in Odeon. That was the last place that you could go. The metro lines would not go over to the right bank. They could not go underneath the Seine. They couldn't go underneath anything. So they basically, it was, you could go from Odeon out south away from Paris. And then on the right bank, you couldn't even get to Châtelet.
Yikes.
Which is probably, maybe Châtelet could go float away. I think it'd be just fine.
Be cleaning it up.
But yeah, on the next day, on January 24th, the city was shutting down more and more. Garbage plants could no longer process. People were even just starting to throw the garbage into the Seine. The Seine at this point also was becoming just horrific because of all of the chemicals that were getting in there. There was a vinegar factory downstream from Paris that the water got in, and it actually exploded, sending more chemicals and everything into the water. The water in places was yellow, which just sounds gross. And then that was just because of a mixture of all of the things. Now also because of the sewer lines, that was also in the water. Right. And then people just throwing garbage. So now everybody, here's this great concern because we're going to die in all this water, but now are we actually just going to get sick as well? So it just was a whole perfect disaster. The islands themselves were even worse shape because now the islands on both sides have, they're surrounded by water. The Ile Saint-Louis, the beautiful romantic island that everybody loves, was actually made of two small islands that they put together in the 17th century, where if you're going down the Ile Saint-Louis, if you get kind of almost, 2/3 of the way down from Notre Dame, there is a wider street in the very middle. There's a little cafe right there, and it's called the Café La Vache, and that is because it was two rivers or two islands. The one island was the Ile de Vache, so it was the island of cows because there were cows once on this island feeding. And so they decided in the 17th century to join these, making a bigger island, but they filled it with debris and just landfill into the center of that. And that morning, during the floods, the mornings they would have that the water when everything was hitting against the sides of it, and it was starting to destroy the walls. And they were worried that some of that debris underneath would actually just might float out into the Seine.
Whoa, gross. That sounds horrible.
Yeah. So it's just like, Like I can't even imagine. I cannot imagine having to live in Paris during the occupation. But then this would be, this would be even, I don't know. This would be pretty up there in the scary factor as well.
Yeah, it sounds pretty gross.
It'd be pretty bad. On January 25th, Zouave was now covered up to his waist, which was 14 and a half feet over the normal level. Shelters had now started to open up all over Paris, including the Église Saint-Sulpice in Saint-Germain, where over 650 people were crowded in there. And the Bon Marché and the BHV donated mattresses and blankets, and the Red Cross was doing all they could to help people by bringing them food. But the poet Guillaume Apollinaire, who was friends with Picasso as well, he would walk around and visit some of these, and he just would kind of walk around and get, see, he had to evacuate his house. He lived over in Passy, which got really hit really, really bad there in Passy as well. He was over here, back over in the Latin Quarter, and he walked into Saint-Sulpice, and he would see like everybody from all ranks of life. It didn't matter. This water was going to get you. And this actually at a time united the people of Paris at first, because everybody was like, this isn't just hitting one income level or, one area of the city. This is affecting everybody. Because even if you weren't, in the actual water, you had, no power, there was no heat, there was no metro lines. Now the stores were starting to, kind of do price gouging of people. And so it was kind of, everybody was in this together, but then of course it started to turn, because then everybody figured, oh, it's nobody in these homes. Now we could sneak into these homes and rob them and steal everything. And then I could charge you, 20 francs for that apple that you want.
Oh, wow. They could just gouge them.
Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of what happens. But on January 26th, the entire mail system stopped. And back then it was because the mail system, there was a bunch of tubes, that if you ever watch some old movies, from like the 40s or 50s, you see this sometimes where they put the mail in a tube and then they just send it down this thing. Well, that's how a lot of the mail was delivered at the time.
Wow.
Instead of they of course had mailmen, but some of the stuff was actually just with this compressed air. But now the post office, that the mail was completely halted, but they also were the main telegraph lines into the city. There was over 760 telegraph lines, 38 of which of those were international telegraph lines. And those were they were threatened that the water was going to get into them. So they were doing everything they can to save it. Then all of a sudden they realized that the water was coming through another area, so they had to abandon everything to get that. They were able to save only one of those 760 lines, and it was luckily one of the ones, the international line that went to England. Otherwise, the world would have been completely cut off to France.
No way.
Yeah, but even back then, we're talking 113 years ago. Even back then, the news of Paris, everybody around the world, just like today, whenever, and because you live there, when something happens in Paris, you get messages from people like, oh my God, are you okay? I just saw in the news that something happened. And you're like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm what? And because people think that if it happens on the they don't see the news doesn't exactly report exactly like, hey, this happened on the Champs-Elysees or this happened here. They just say Paris. And so it was still the same. It was that way 113 years ago as well. And some of it they were saying, there were some reports of it like Paris has, the morgue is flooded and dead bodies are floating down the streets of Paris. And that stuff wasn't true. But back then they did just like today, just now, on one point it spreads faster now, but on the second, now you kind of actually, if you do some work, you could look into and find out what is true or what isn't true. But now, they completely cut out the city. They had no way to get in touch with anybody except for this one telegraph line. At this point now, all of the soldiers around Paris, the prefecture and everybody were actually calling anybody in to help, to bring boats, to do anything. So they were actually, soldiers were coming in with boats, and they were now at this point starting to do all they could to help rescue people, which actually kind of gave everybody a little glimpse of hope, thinking, oh, okay, maybe we will survive this. Because after a couple of days of that, you're like, where is everybody? Who's going to help us? But there again, they call it the, once in a century flood. Well, it's been 113 years. And so this is another thing where it's like they need to keep these things in mind. And we'll talk about some of the more recent ones too. But over in the Jardin des Plantes that I mentioned earlier, at that point also, because they are right there next to the Seine, they're a good maybe city block away from the Seine. Of course, that was getting flooded. The water was coming in, and for some of those animals, it was filling up their cages. And so some of them are trapped. They ended up bringing down a boat over there, and it was almost like Noah's Ark. They were literally filling up this boat with animals. There was a giraffe who did not want to get onto the boat and ended up dying. There was an alligator that got out before the people got there to save him, got out and got into one of the cats, one of the smaller, large cats. And that cat, of course, did not survive. But there's a picture you could find online of a polar bear and people above like a little bridge, and the polar bear looking up at it like you would see a dog, like, please help me, like looking up at the polar bear. I don't think I'd reach down for the polar bear, but it's just the flood affected everything and everyone and everything in its track. On January 27th, Zouave was now covered up to his shoulders. The nearby assembly was starting to fill with water into the central meeting rooms, where they were quickly trying to pass laws to help people. On the 27th is when the Louvre that sits up a bit higher along the Seine, if you're standing over in the left bank and you look over, you can see how the Louvre is just a little bit higher, that portion of the ground. But on the seventh day, it looked like it wasn't going to withstand the water's force. So workers quickly sprung into action with sandbags and cement to strengthen the walls of the quay, working some of it underwater. At one point, they were completely covered up over their head with water as they were trying to do this. They started to use the cobblestones because the sandbags, they just didn't have enough. They started to use cobblestones and even cement. And the cobblestones, they would put those in with the bags with the sand and then even patch up holes. But they worked all through the night. They worked about 19 hours straight through the night. And when the sun came up the next morning, they realized that they were able to outsmart the water, and they kept it from my beloved Louvre.
Oh my gosh, it must have been such a nightmare and so scary. I mean, think how close we were to losing so much art and losing the Louvre and everything.
Yeah. And that's, and then when they do call these century disasters, there's obviously nobody from 1910 is still alive. And while we do have, and I'm sure that those people have a lot more research and information at their disposal than what I was able to find, but still, like, sometimes it's like, okay, the people that actually went through some of the stuff are the best people to have, to go to talk about this, because you could only talk about this stuff so much until the actual time comes. You never know. So, but on January 28th, the day started, the Seine was now at its highest point that it would get. It was 27.9 feet, and Zouave was buried up to his neck in water. The lines of the metro that stretched for over 2 miles, that went from the Austerlitz to the Orsay, completely filled with water and flooded. The lower level of the Orsay, which at that point was still a train station, was completely filled. I also saw a photo of that. I'll share that whole area. Basically, now, if you're in that lower level of sculptures and the lower galleries, that would be completely underwater now.
Whoa, that's so crazy.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting when you see these things. And then if you know that space, or like that area of town where you're looking at this photo, and then you see it, and then you're like, oh, because if you just look at this photo, you're like, that's just water down the street. But then if you know that area, you take this picture, go and look, and you're like, whoa, wait a minute. Like, that is all the way up that high. Yeah. Just absolutely crazy. The Eiffel Tower also had shifted because it was built into sand. It was very deep, but they built it in that part of the, right at the edge of the water is sand. So it moved actually 3/4 of an inch off of its base. But Gustave Eiffel was quite the innovator, and he had installed a hydraulic pump in place to move it if that was ever to happen.
Whoa, that's wild.
And 3/4 of an inch might not sound like a lot if you put your fingers together, but when you think of how huge and heavy the Eiffel Tower is, the fact that it moved and then they were able to move it back it's just amazing, just incredible.
Yeah.
But the next,
how to do that?
yeah, and it's
such an engineering feat.
Yeah, and then the Eiffel Tower, we've talked about it before, but the Eiffel Tower also, it grows and it moves. When it gets hot out, it expands. So and it's kind of, it's interesting because it's kind of a living thing. But they put all those things, these engineers keep all these things in mind and put all these things in force. But it was the next morning on January 29th that the Parisians woke up to a very welcome sight. The blue skies and sunshine had returned. The rain stopped and the sun came out, and people were yelling out their windows, and where they could, they were dancing in the streets. They were so happy to finally see a day without, gray and rain. The waters, as I said, were yellow. It was just floating with garbage and sewage and just everything under the sun. The next day on January 30th, the water slowly went down a little bit, but it some of the parts of the city couldn't hold it together any longer. Near the Palais Royal, a wall collapsed, sending sewage into a basement that eventually the entire building had to just be demolished. As the streets to Notre Dame could now be somewhat navigated, the Archbishop Leon Adolphe Hennay held a mass there at 3 p.m. on January 30th. No doubt, I'm sure he was thanking Saint Genevieve, who was high above in the relic of her was high above in the rooster on top of the spire that was still there until the day that the fire burned. But she survived, and she will go back. And all at the end, 643 rescues happened, and only 6 lives were lost.
Wow, only 6 lives. That's shocking.
6. I know, isn't that so amazing? It was only 6. It got to almost 30 feet above average. 24,000 buildings were flooded. 14,000 people were evacuated, and 5,900 people were hospitalized. The flood would impact the city for years to come. It also destroyed thousands of jobs. Entire industries were shut down for months, if not years. From agriculture to river workers to rail trade, 48,000 jobs were impacted.
Okay, so the bigger effects were like the job loss. I mean, that probably killed people.
Yeah. I mean, when the water rises, they stop traffic, and this just recently happened, because boats can't get underneath the bridges. So, and that it took 35 days for the water to recede. It wasn't until April 8th that the Seine was finally back to its normal level. So you're talking from January 21st until April 8th. So all those bateau mouches, all of those things, none of that. I mean, they were, I'm sure, running before April 8th, but none of everything's impacted. So it's the domino effect on some of this stuff. It's just kind of absolutely crazy. If you equated the cost of the damages today, it would be over $2.5 billion.
Wow, that's insane.
Yeah. Yeah, the water finally fell down onto his ankles on February 8th. But like I said, it took 2 more months on April 8th for the Seine to be back to its normal level. So it was pretty dire times watching all that. And since then, it keeps flooding. I have a list and I could type them all up and put them on my website. I wasn't going to go through and be like 29.5 meters on January, 1951. But I mean, they of course keep, and it's a river. And so of course these things happen, and they've happened for, now for centuries. But again, like I said earlier, they do say these things, in the West Coast of the US, it's always, waiting for the big one. They call it the earthquake, that they say, if not, it's not if, but when. And so, and since then, the flood in 2016 was probably the highest that it's gotten. From May to June, the Seine rose to its highest point in 34 years. That was a different one because that was late in, a lot of these floods, if you look at it over time, a lot of them are January, February, but May to June, was later. And those kind of get a little bit scarier because you have all of this runoff and the dams that are holding it when the water is kind of at its peak, and they hold it back so that they could, let some of this water out in the drier months of the summer. And so at this point, this was all holding up, and then you get to May and June, and then it's like these reservoirs and these dams are already full. So now there's nowhere to put this extra water that's coming in. So that's always kind of the scary part of it. They now have in the 20th century, they put in a list of triggers. And so when it gets to 3.2 meters above, an alert is triggered. At 3.3, the roads are closed along the Seine. At 5.1, the Arriere is closed. It goes along the Arriere Sea. And then at 6 feet, at 6 meters, it gets the Neptune plan is triggered, which now it sounds like a superhero. And that's basically when it's like the highest level of like, this is alert. But at 7.2, 7.2 meters is when they say that point, then the metros are flooded. But 2016, there was a big one. 2018, I remember back last January when I was there, it had been raining for quite a bit before Christmas. And I remember walking over to the Louvre every morning, and there's those little steps below the Pont de Carousel. And, there's probably 7 or 8 that go from the Seine to the side. And every day I'd walk by and I'd be like, okay, now I see 6. And the next day, now I see 4. And the water, it's amazing how quick it rises. But then it had like a week and a half of dry weather, and it quickly went back down. So it goes up and down all the time. But now you'll be even more alert. And then if we have a lot of rainy days, or you better watch the news and see what it's doing in the mountains or off the coast of Brittany, and be on high alert.
Yeah, exactly. Be ready for that horror movie scene. But I mean, it is great that they dug it down so low, because I mean, now we're a little more protected when it rises. It's crazy to think of it being that close to the Louvre or the roads, like being right up against it.
Yeah. Well, after the 2016 one, because it did that was basically in modern memory that I have of them getting concerned. And that was funny, because I remember watching, TV or something in the US, and they were like the Louvre, or maybe it was 2018. I think it was 2018. And, it was like Good Morning America. And they're like, the Mona Lisa in Paris is in danger. And I was like, what? And they were saying, because the waters are rising. And I was like, the Mona Lisa is on what is considered the United States second floor. There's you have a whole lot of other issues, like of mass death. If the Mona Lisa is threatening, if the water is lapping up against the Mona Lisa, there's just no news to be talked about, because people are dead.
Yeah, no.
So it was
those headlines.
Yeah. So, and I just, that's why I haven't watched American news in like 3 years. But it is, since then, because in 2018, 2016 and 2018, the Louvre had that scare again. And so they actually, after 2018, built this huge location near the Louvre Lens, because there is another Louvre that's in France, up in northern France in Lens, which is a teeny tiny town. And I still have not gone up to, I'm really excited to go up there and check it out. But they built this huge facility, and it's like state-of-the-art facility to put the reserves in, because when you look at the Louvre, even though it is the largest museum in the world, you only see 35% of what the Louvre owns. And the building is massive. So think about, there's 65%, there's 2.5 times, basically 2.5 times the Louvre that was underground. So, and, just like standing, in these, they have these big things they pull out, and the paintings are, these huge metal, like almost walls they could pull out, and the paintings are on there. And so they built this huge structure north of France because of this, because it's, and they're saying it with global warming and everything, it's just going to get worse. So, the Louvre was smart and moved everything. The Orsay, if it sits actually lower. And so I don't know what their precautions are, but obviously the Orsay is smaller. They don't have as much stuff, but they definitely do have stuff underground, and they are literally even closer to the water there. It's more, but maybe they were able to redo that, because the Orsay, the building itself, is obviously much newer than the Louvre. But it is, it is one of those thoughts you have to think of. And I had people that I knew that live on Ile Saint Louis that said in 2018, part of their, their basement definitely got water into it. So, this is just all those things we get to have, living in a big city. At least there's not any earthquakes in Paris.
Yeah, exactly. Tsunamis. I mean, there's always going to be something that can get us, right? But I mean, with climate change, who knows what's going to happen in the next 20 years. But what a fascinating history that we can learn from. And definitely head over to Claudine's website, check out the photos, check out more information, ClaudineHemingway.com, and tune in next week, guys.
Thanks for listening today, guys. If you're interested in learning more about Claudine, her tours, history, and the beautiful photographs that she posts all over Instagram, tune into her website, claudinehemingway.com.